Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from the APO Secretariat in Tokyo. Thank you for joining the P-Talk today. I'm Tat Manabe, who will be anchoring this session. Today's P-Talk focuses on innovations in agri-food sector. Like in other sectors, like industries and services, innovation is a key driver to enhance productivity in agri-food system. But the agri-food sector needs quicker, wider, and deeper innovations due to multiple pressing concerns, such as the need to feed the growing populations and the effect of climate change. And also the COVID-19 pandemic has created other immediate challenges. So today we are honored to host today's P-Talk by Dr. Paul Teng from Singapore. He is the Managing Director and Dean of National International Institute of Education International in Singapore. And also he's a professor in Nanyang Technological University. It's a leading technology university in Singapore. And now he is leading educations on advancing agri-food innovations in the Asian Pacific region and involved in setting Singaporean national food security policy. So in his career, he has experience in the private sector and public sector, as well as academic. So he has vast experience in multiple sectors, and he has contributed through his career to adapt innovations in the agri-food sector in the Asia Pacific region and other places as well. So good afternoon, Professor Teng. How are you doing?
Good afternoon, Dr. Manabe.
Thank you very much for joining this P-Talk today. So we are glad to hear from you about the innovations in agri-food with your rich experience. And thank you very much for preparing your presentations in a way to respond to the 5 questions that I sent to you earlier. So if you don't mind, then we'd like to go these questions one by one.
Certainly.
Thank you. And viewers, thank you for joining. And if you also have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the first question. Okay, the first question that I asked to Paul is that why have the innovations in the agri-food sector become more important than in the past? Always the innovation is important, but nowadays we believe that agri-food areas, then innovations are quite a critical part. So I appreciate you share your view on this question. Thank you, Paul.
Certainly, be very happy to, Dr. Manabe. As you said, this first question really is a very important question. Innovations have become a lot more important in today's context because the problems facing us in the agri-food sector have become more intense. You alluded to some of them, and I'll just again mention some of these. You know, at a high level, the need to increase food supply by 50% by 2050. You know, this is what FAO stated in 2016. And then we know, those of us who deal with small farmers, of the need to increase productivity. And in the case of small farms, IFPRI is estimated by as much as 200%. Now, of course, we're also every year seeing a reduction in land, arable land, and freshwater resources. So one of the biggest challenges facing us is to find new farming space, not just land, but space. And of course, the perennial problem of food losses and waste is one that we need to tackle with. Of course, finally, this gap that exists in the use of modern technologies is a gap that we definitely have to bridge if we are to see any significant progress in tackling food issues with us. Let me unpack some of these issues in the next slide here. Basically, this just amplifies the first slide. And if you look at the top row, it basically are some of the demand problems that we all are very familiar with, I'm sure. Population growth, urbanization, growing diet, changing diet patterns, and so on. But on the supply side is where, again, many issues have become so obvious and so challenging. The lack of labor, aging farmers, increased uncertainties about capital investments. Then there's natural resources. I mentioned degraded land, declining water resources, and also climate change as a natural resource. Of course, technology divide, and in specific terms, as far as productivity is concerned, yield gaps, the large gaps that exist, yield gaps, also the phenomenon of declining yields, the pests and diseases, of course, food losses and waste. I don't have time in this webinar to go through each and every one of these. So what I propose to do is to just highlight a few of these so that we understand the severity of the issues facing us. This next slide basically shows crop yield gaps. I think for many of us who work in this area, it's become very obvious that actual yields in farmers' fields are only a fraction of what potentially the seed can yield, the best seed. Okay? So any gap between the potential theoretical and actual farmers' yield is what we call a yield gap. And yield gaps can reach as much as 50% in some crops. And we know and we understand many of the factors behind why there are yield gaps. Okay? And suffice to say too that in today's world, we do have breeding technologies that can help us reduce those yield gaps. For example, by conferring more resistance to diseases or insects, or by conferring drought tolerance, just as examples. So yield gaps are a major issue that really requires a lot of innovation to help solve at the farmer level. Then the question of pathogens, pests, which again has been a long-standing problem for almost every agricultural ecosystem in the world. This very seminal piece of work that was put out a couple of years ago really shows that on the average, the major crops that we depend on for food, feed, and fiber easily suffer 10 to 30% losses from pests and diseases. So the big question then is, what can we recover by dealing with these pests and diseases? A major challenge indeed. It requires innovation to address. Then climate change. I won't say very much about climate change. I think only suffice to say that even as prestigious an organization as the Asian Development Bank has warned that we got to do something about climate change. Otherwise, it's going to be an existential issue for all of us going forward in the next decade and even more. Yeah? And even today, in even the recent past, we see some of the symptoms of climate change, especially the unexpected severe weather events, typhoons and so on, have become increased in frequency, and delayed monsoons, too much water, too little water, and so on. So climate change is a reality that we have to deal with. And again, requires innovations, not just in technology, but also in farming systems. Then, of course, food loss and waste. I won't say very much about this, except that, we waste a lot of food. I mentioned earlier, pests and diseases can cause up to 30% loss, and most of those are pre-harvest. Post-harvest wise, especially in the household level, at the level of F&B institutions, food and beverage institutions, a big chunk of the food is not properly used. And if you think about it, there's the energy, there's the labor, and so on that goes into producing this food that is not eaten. It's just basically wasted. I will put to you later on how waste valorization technology is such an important technology in this particular century for us. Okay? So what I've tried to do in this first few minutes is to show to you really the extent of some of the problems we face in this world that really urgently require innovation. Help us. So thank you, Ted, for the first question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teng, about your insight around this. While there are growing concerns of the population growth and climate changes, as you show, there are still potential, like you mentioned, that the yield gap could reach up to 50%. Still, this is the kind of a growing potential there. And also that you mentioned about the food loss, where this can be filled to increase the total food supply at the end. Mm-hmm. So I think those are really the space that innovations could help to tackle with the challenges. So then my next question would be that then what are the leading innovations in the agri-food sector? We hear a lot about genetically modified crops and genome editing and digital technology, etc. So we would like to hear from you that what are the leading innovations for
Mhm.
now to the future, please.
Certainly, certainly. Again, this is such an important question. But let me take a step backwards and really share that if you look at the way agriculture has developed, historically, progress has been made in agriculture depending on many, many disruptive discoveries and innovations. I think some of us tend to forget that Mendel's laws, hybrid seed, mechanization, fertilization. In fact, all these are innovations that has really helped us to get to where we are today. Okay, but in today's context, because of the influence of the fourth industrial revolution, third industrial revolution, we tend to talk a little bit about disruptive technologies. So if you're new to this terminology, excuse me. But if you already know this, also excuse me. But disruptive technologies are very useful cap to wear to understand the role of innovation in the agri-food sector. Basically, a disruptive technology is one that displaces an established technology and shakes up the whole industry, or it's a groundbreaking product that creates a completely new industry. Okay? Now, by definition, whether you agree or not, GMOs were disruptive technology in different ways, right? For cotton growers in India and China who previously could not grow cotton, the GM cotton was a lifesaver for them. That's what a disruptive technology is. Okay? But let me give a bit more detail. I mentioned that there were some innovations that changes. Now in the 20th century, that's passed, there were really four what I consider very important innovations that brought us to where we are today. The first is mechanization. Okay, many of us tend to forget that mechanization is not a given. Okay, although in many, many modern, even small farms today, we see mechanical devices being used. But not too long ago, and even today, human labor, animal labor, animal traction is still the main source, right? To plow the field and so on. So mechanization has been important to help us as an innovation, but it's also helped us to grow, in fact, more, okay, with less land. Okay? Then the second major innovation that's come about are fertilizers. Again, it wasn't that long ago, quite frankly, that that most of the world was using just compost and manure, and yields tended to stabilize. But when fertilizers came along, we saw significant yield boost. Okay? Although some of us, probably who are listening will argue that there's been negative externalities as well, which we all accept. Okay? As with any technology, the important thing is how do you manage the innovation for the benefit of everybody? Pesticides is the other category. We lose so much insects and diseases every year, okay? And weeds included, right? Without pesticides, without herbicides, fungicides, I will put to you that our losses would even be much higher and our yield gaps would even be much higher. Now, finally, in the 20th century, I would put to you that the fourth innovation that was very important was genetics and seeds. I think those of us who study biology will remember Mendel's laws, his experiments crossing, peas and so on. That really was the basis for modern plant breeding. Okay? I think in past centuries, our forefathers tended to select seeds, okay, rather ad hoc. But in the 20th century, we finally had the modern means, okay, of doing modern breeding, okay, to create new varieties. But having said that, then back to Dr. Manabe's question. What are the innovations that we see going into this particular century? Okay? And again, here I make no excuse. Okay, this is my interpretation of what some lead tech innovations are, and not everyone may agree with me. But I can assure you that I've studied this field quite a bit, and I've picked these 8 innovations because I think that they're very important for us. But again, another but is we don't do innovations for the sake of innovations. How do innovations help us in the 21st century? And I refer you back to the upper part of the slide, where I would argue that disruptive innovations are needed for 4 main reasons, which I've touched on briefly. One is to increase farm productivity, very important, reduce losses, narrow the yield gap, and so on. Second is to make food more available, okay? Because if we increase productivity, the expectation is that the total amount of food will then become higher and more available. And one of the important aspects of food security is making sure that there's enough available food of course, affordable, safe, and so on, to feed people irrespective of whether they live in the countryside or the cities. Now, the third, in today's context, for disruptive innovations, why they're needed is to improve agricultural sustainability. Okay, we hear a lot of discussion on today about how today's food systems are broken. What can we do? In fact, the environment and now climate change and so on. So we need to seriously ask questions on how do we improve sustainability of agriculture without damaging the environment, at the same time feeding people. Of course, the final bullet here is nutrition security. The last century, we didn't talk that much about nutrition security. We talked about food security, availability. In this century, we're getting more and more concerned now about malnutrition, not just not enough food, but too much, excess food. We're also concerned about minerals and so on. So innovations are needed to help us improve nutrition security. And this links back to what I said earlier about urbanization and changing diet patterns. Okay? As diets change in urban areas, there's a real threat to us that the balanced diet is being disrupted. Okay? So let me move on then to say a few more words about these 8 leading disruptive innovations, which I've mentioned. But before then, it also pays us to have a quick look, a backward look, and say, what is an assessment of the current state of our technology adoption in Asia? The first part of the table basically shows the 20th century. And I've already mentioned this, for example, synthetic fertilizer, pretty wide adoption now throughout Asia, improved seeds, very much so, especially in the favorable irrigated lands. Pesticides, water augmentation measures, digitized equipment just starting to pick up in the last century. Now, in this century, the disruptive technologies will include these digital agriculture, which we're just starting to see take off and has been accelerated, in fact, by the pandemic. Biotechnology applications, not as widespread as it should be, but I think, again, picking up, especially the non-GMO biotechnologies. Control environment farming technology. Okay, how do we climate buffer our agriculture? Okay, this is where indoor farming comes in. I'll share a little bit on that. Okay, produce identification and verification. Consumers wanting to know for sure that what they buy is what they've paid for and is what it states on the label, right? And then technologies to connect farmers to markets and consumers. Again, a reasonable state, but a lot can be done. Okay, and then factory food technologies, including things like lab-based meat, protein and cellular meat and so on. So this is actually a very simple way to assess where we are, okay, from my perspective, yeah? And please feel free to agree, disagree with me in your Q&A, because it's really nice to have an exchange. But let me now spend the next few minutes, to just share very quickly what these technologies mean. So the first disruptive technology that I talked about are digital technologies. We see now a lot of on-farm portable decision aids to help farmers, even rice, in the case of rice, Erie's famous crop rice manager. We see the use of drones, sensors, and then the Internet of Things. We see e-commerce to link farmers to consumers, and also financial services. Because one of the biggest problems that small farmers face is access to credit. Okay? Being able to in fact, get in touch with the appropriate people who have the financing. Yeah. So all these are aspects of the digital technology application in agriculture, which we're seeing now picked up quite a bit in this particular century. Biotechnology. When we're now going beyond the era of GMOs. 1996 was the first year when we saw genetically modified crops come on the world scene. Since that time now, today there are close to 200 million hectares being grown in 2018 alone, and some 20-something countries growing this. Yeah, in fact, 70 countries actually approved GMOs for feed and food processing itself. But what is encouraging for this particular century is gene editing technologies. I'm sure many of you have heard of gene editing, CRISPR, and so on. What this finally will allow us to do is that it's not a GMO. In other words, most times we don't have to introduce a new gene. We're just using the existing genome, okay, either cutting it or in some way modifying it, the current genome with no new genes, and then producing properties that we want it. For example, the non-browning trait, climate change tolerance, and so on. Yeah, so very powerful tool indeed as a disruptive technology. Third, to cater to the reduced land and space and water available for farming, this third disruptive innovation is what I would call novel environments for farming. What are the new environments which we have not really used in the past? Vertical farming, indoor vertical farming, is a key innovation in this particular century. Started with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and so on. It's now catching up even in the Western world, and including other countries in Asia, where everything is controlled environment, indoor, artificial light, you control CO2, control water, control lighting. And you can increase your productivity at least 5 to 10 times for the same space that you have. Indoor fish farming, again, many of these are operating now. Aeroponics, growing vegetables without salt and water, with misting. Now, of course, one of the latest innovations, just very quickly, is being able to grow crops in the sea. Okay, not just through helophytic, plants derived through genetics, but having platforms. And you think of what this does to the carbon footprint. It reduces it, very severely. Okay? I need to move on into time. The fourth disruptive innovation I want to share with you is food and feed identity. This goes to traceability. Okay? And this is the big problem that has plagued distributors. Okay? Farmers, need to assure consumers, and consumers need to be assured that they are buying what they're supposed to be paying for. And there are many different techniques. One example is on fish, this DNA traceability system that allows the buyer to verify indeed where the fish actually comes from, where it's been fed. Yeah. So disruptive 4. Now, disruptive 5 is supply chain connectivity. I mentioned that the supply chain is so important in this modern world, right? And we now see a lot of ways whereby through logistics, through infrastructure, through systems that can monitor how the produce behaves in transit and have the conditions modified, and then finally being able to predict disturbances to the supply chain to help us assure that the supply chain does do what it's supposed to do: get food from the farm, from the source, to the consumer. Okay? Now, number 6 is one that Singapore is investing a lot of time and money in, novel food. This truly is a disruptive innovation. Novel food, by definition, is food that we have not eaten before in the past. Okay? Microbial protein, cellular meat, plant-based protein, just some examples. Okay? Now, insect protein is novel in some countries, but not in others. Okay? But again, the emergence of so many new insect farms now around the world to produce not just animal feed, but also potentially protein to feed human beings. And as we all know, insects are some of the best converters of food waste in the world, of biomass, okay, into edible protein. So I'll put to you, ladies and gentlemen, that disruptive innovation number 4, novel food, is something that's here to stay. Number 5, innovations to reduce loss and waste. Here, I very quickly touch on a couple of these. One is through the use of biotechnologies, okay, to allow ripening of fruits to be delayed. Okay. The other is to have controlled environment farming, where very little is in fact lost, because every plant is monitored very carefully. And as part of this whole picture of reducing loss and waste, using discarded food, okay, to upcycle and recycle. Right? So this is disruptive innovation number 7. Let me move on to the last one, and this is where the whole question of sustainability, circular systems comes in. Okay? And today, in the 21st century, we hear a lot of this term, waste valorization. How do we put value into what is considered food waste? How do we turn food waste into odorless fertilizer? How do we do vermiculture? How do we use, for example, black soldier fly to eat up food waste and then convert this into fertilizer to be part of the circular system for farming, or into animal feed or human protein? Okay? So with that, I hope I've again given you a very quick, view of some of these disruptive technologies that really are so exciting for many of us. Okay? So thank you, Teng, for that question.
Thank you, Dr. Paul Teng. This is quite an excellent list of disruptive innovations. And I see that those innovations are not just trying to boost the productivity, but looking at a couple of different important aspects, like you mentioned in the beginning, like agricultural sustainability and nutritional securities. All those key components could be addressed by those innovations at the same time, rather than just trying to increase the productivity, try to increase the yield. So that's a great list of the innovations. Thank you very much for sharing. So the next question is around what happened during the pandemic period. So there's a lot of supply chain disruption because of the COVID. So my next question is that how the innovations been around during the pandemic period is being accelerated or decelerated? Could you share your view, please?
Certainly. My view is that one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic is that, in fact, it has helped us to accelerate innovation. There's an old saying, right? Invention is need or the problem is the mother of invention. Yeah, I think we saw a big need for innovations during the pandemic. I think it's useful to ask ourselves, what happened? What happened to the agri-food sector during the pandemic? And some of these bullets here, I'm very sure have been experienced by many of you. Supply chain interruptions, labor shortages, and so on, right? So as a result of which, there were calls in many countries, to increase the level of self-production, to shorten food supply chains, to support locally produced food more and more, to invest more in R&D and so on, and also to take action to safeguard supply chains. Okay? So this is the kind of background, within which I think innovation forces have been operating during the pandemic. Now, earlier this year, I actually wrote this article about how COVID-19 has accelerated new agricultural technology development and adoption in Asia Pacific. The article can be summarized basically in this table here. If you look at the innovation types, starting from digitalization in agriculture, to biotechnology, all the way down to waste valorization, every category, I think we've seen an acceleration, an increase in investment, increase in effort, okay, by many, many countries. Again, it's not the kind of thing that you get perfect data on, okay, but if you try and monitor the scene in many countries, we can detect, in fact, a significant change in trying to increase digitization, to deal with short supply chains and so on. I put here biotechnology because I haven't really seen a big increase in biotechnology in Asia Pacific yet. But again, I think it's something that's increasing, especially with gene editing coming on board. Okay? So basically, my view is that one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic has been to create a lot more awareness and urgency, okay, to look at food security, to look at the agri-food sector. And that in turn has cascaded down to those who fund research, those who support entrepreneurship, and the young startups that say, I want to get involved in this to help deal with the problem of the pandemic. Yeah. So thanks, Ted. I think I'll stop there. I can answer this question.
Okay, thank you very much. So far, we have learned that how important innovations are in the agricultural food sector, and also we learned about what are the leading innovations in the sector. And we just learned that innovations are somewhat accelerated during the pandemic period, which is good news during this difficult time. So maybe the next question is around what are really the enablers, particularly for the Asian Pacific countries, to adapt and accelerate those innovations that we discussed. Could you share your view on this question, please?
Yeah, certainly. Again, this is a very important question. You recall I said earlier that technology on its own doesn't get to its end users unless there are enabling factors to do so. Okay? But before we answer this question, I think it's also useful for us to understand what the innovation process is all about. Creativity does not equate innovation. The innovation is when you've created something but it's also going through the whole process of being developed into a product that can be used by the end user. That is a true innovation, right? From discovery, creation, all the way to the end user, where there's some potential impact to play. And that's really what this slide shows, yeah? Especially the FAO definition, which is in the second half of the slide. I mean, I urge you to have a look at that at your own leisure. Now, we also recognize that innovation, one of the biggest enablers of innovation is that there is a value chain. In other words, when people innovate, they have new ideas through science and technology, they create products, processes, there's value creation, there's value addition, there's value capture, there's value preservation. So the net result is that in the public sector, innovations allow the public sector to have more impact. Okay, for example, helping farmers produce more. In the private sector, enterprises that help to increase competitiveness, market share, and so on. Okay, but suffice to say that, I mean, there are challenges in adopting innovations. Okay? And this old saying about how ideas are a dime a dozen. Okay? And successful innovation only occurs when the idea is translated into products which are adopted by farmers and consumers. What are some of these challenges? Because understanding the challenges enables us to understand the enablers. Okay? Obviously, one of them is the relevance of the innovation. What is the problem or need that is addressing? And I shared with you earlier on what some of the problems are. We don't want to get in a situation where technology drives a problem. We want the problem to drive technology. In other words, we're responding to a problem, okay, and not just doing research for research's sake. Right? There's aspects of what we call freedom to operate, okay, a real challenge. In the case of biotechnology, not all countries are equipped to use new biotechnologies. And this links to the regulatory aspects, whether it's environmental safety, food safety, and so on. For example, with novel food, with the plant-based protein, with the cellular meat and so on, there's been no history of regulating these at all and food safety testing, which is why Singapore was the first country, not too long ago, to approve a cellular chicken nugget. A chicken nugget that was produced in basically a big bioreactor and not harvested from a live chicken at all. Okay? Now, then, of course, there are technology transfer mechanisms, which are major challenges. We all know how extension services are usually underfunded in most countries. So what can we do to overcome that? How can we enable that? Of course, the big question then is, are farmers ready? Okay? Is there follow-up service to the spreading the technology? And then is the public ready? Okay, for many of this new stuff. For example, if you look at vegetables that are grown in hydroponics, we have data to show that some parts of the population are not ready to accept vegetables that are not grown on soil. Yeah. So these are the challenges, and having these challenges helps us understand why certain governments have put in certain enablers. So let me share with you this next slide, which basically is a listing, as I've done my surveys, that really lists what are the important enablers of agri-food innovation. Okay? The first and most obvious one is really supportive government policies, which translates into supportive regulations and instruments. Yeah, I'll exemplify it with the Singapore case study. Okay? So policies, regulations, instruments all go together. Now, the second, equally important, is the investment in human resources, education, and training. Okay? If you wanted to create an innovation system, do you have the human capital to help you do that? Okay. Fortunately, in Asia, we do have many countries, in APO countries, for example, that are very well endowed with human resources. The third is the existence of coordinating or focal organizations, okay, that help to link up basically the production marketing process altogether. Okay, in most of the successful innovation systems that we've seen, they are what we call champions. Okay, whether they're politicians, whether they're scientists, whether they're farmer organizations, champions that can help to coordinate this whole ecosystem of innovation. Then, of course, the next is coordinated infrastructure for research and development, okay, and also commercial enterprise and the supply chain. Okay, I think innovation systems don't remain innovative, okay, unless there's a continual supply of new ideas, new technologies, and so on. And that's where the R&D, research and development, comes in. Yeah, and this then also requires the engagement of the capital markets and financing mechanisms. Capital markets mainly of the private sector. Financing mechanisms could include government banks, or even government finance ministries, that provide certain kinds of funding to basically push innovation. Now, of course, then underpinning all this is the culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. Okay? And this is actually, in fact, very critical for long-term sustainability of an agri-food innovation system. If we look at examples like, Silicon Valley in California, okay, that's in fact where the culture for innovation is so strong and where many of the modern agri-food startups today have originated from the Silicon Valley area. Then finally, a very important enabler is how do you include smallholder farmers, okay, in this whole innovation system? How do they play, in very colloquial terms? Yeah, how do they participate and also derive benefit from having that be innovation? And finally, social license. And what the social license means is really society accepting the products, okay, being agreeable to the nature of the food, the nature of the production system itself that has come from the innovation. Okay. So what I've done in this answer to Dr. Manabe's question is to give you again a quick overview, okay, of what challenges innovation, what are some of the key enablers of innovation, okay, which can be viewed in total or separately. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tang. This is quite a good list of enablers. But it also tells that this is a multi-stakeholder approach or the work that a single unit like private or the government or the academia could done, but everybody needs to work together for farmers to the value chain to the consumers. So this is quite a complex mechanism to successfully introduce the innovations. Thank you very much. So now I like to move to the last question. This is about Singapore. So I saw a news talking about 30 by 30. So 30% self-sufficiency by year 2030. So I'm a bit surprised at Singapore, as you know, that we know that this is not a big country for agriculture, and Singapore definitely is not a country of agriculture. But the Singapore is very serious of food security. So that's what I felt by looking at the article. So I am, and also I'm interested in you have very robust ecosystem to support this big vision. So here I would like to learn from you how the Singapore tackles for food security and achieving this 30 by 30. I think you are the part of this strategic direction. So appreciate you share what's going on in Singapore. Thank you.
Very happy to do so, Ted. Very happy to do so indeed. In fact, I probably don't have enough time in this webinar to do justice to the whole 30 by 30 story. Okay? But what I'd like to say, building on the previous question, was that for innovation to work, you really need a supporting ecosystem, which is what I think Dr. Manabe summarized, different components and so on. Huh? But very important is the articulation at the policy level. And Singapore is not unique in that sense, because I've visited many countries. In fact, in most countries, an ecosystem does exist, the different components, but perhaps not as well articulated as in the Singapore case. Okay? In Singapore, it is well articulated because of the pressing need that was shown up by the pandemic, okay, when supply chains were interrupted, and for a country that imports 90% of its food, okay, having only access to 10% of such production made it so vulnerable, okay, which is really also one of the driving reasons why, at the policy level, the government decided to formulate and implement what they call this 30 by 30 strategy, okay, to be at least, minimally 30% self-sufficient in nutrition needs, okay, by the year 2020, and optimistically even higher than that. Now, this slide actually shows some of both the policy instruments and the measures that have taken place, and it's quite illustrative of what a small country can do, and there are a lot of learnings from here. If we look at this slide, okay, obviously in March 2019 was the articulation of this 30 by 30 strategy. That is the umbrella strategy that has been driving a lot of activities within the ecosystem. Okay? Then one of the first outcomes, in fact, was the formation of an agri-food innovation park. Innovation park specially set up to allow entrepreneurs, researchers to come together to pilot test new innovations. Okay? And then, of course, all this is not helpful unless there's money to back it up, which is why the government itself decided to invest its own funds, $144 million, to accelerate the research and development. And this has now come to be called the Singapore Food Story. Okay? But then, recognizing the importance of the ecosystem itself, private sector was encouraged to come in. Okay? So we see now accelerators that help to nurture small companies. We see venture capital companies at the bottom here, like AgFunder, ULab, and so on, that have provided startup funds for a lot of young companies. And interestingly enough, many of these companies that are funded are not Singapore-based at all, but they potentially can contribute to Singapore's food security. Okay? So I just want to make that point there, that many of these venture capital companies, although based in Singapore, have a global presence. Okay? Then, of course, when the pandemic hit, there were more activities. Right? Singapore started a Singapore Institute for Food and Biotechnology Innovations, and then it decided to go into food cluster transformation and so on, and then also food safety, because in today's definition, food security involves and includes food safety as well. It's not just availability, affordability itself, or nutrition, but also the safety aspects. So the government, in fact, invested in a new lab, a new hub called a Future Ready Food Safety Hub. Okay? And then, of course, finally, the latest development is just last November, launching this SAIL, Singapore Agrifood Innovation Laboratory. Okay? But let me unpack this a little bit more. And this next slide is a bit, crowded, but I'll be very happy to share with you all the paper from which this was drawn. But what I wanted to show you is that this ecosystem approach is very illustrative of what is happening in other countries as well. You've got the research organizations, which includes the universities. You've got actual farms themselves, and this is just a sampling of some of the farms in Singapore. Although we don't have large area, we do have a lot of very intensive, high-tech farms in Singapore, in vegetables and in fish, these two, yeah? Then part of this ecosystem was also to show the importance of having regulatory agencies as part of the system, having industry groups, like I'm sure some of you are aware of CropLife Asia. CropLife Asia, in fact, is based in Singapore. And then there's several others like this, like Food Industry Asia, it's also based in Singapore. And they're all part of the ecosystem. Okay? And there's so much self-fertilization within the ecosystem, which is very important in the innovation ecosystem, the cross-fertilization, the self-fertilization of ideas, exchanges, and so on. Yeah? So I said this is a very crowded figure, but just to illustrate to you the different components of the ecosystem, some of which I'm very sure already exist in your country. But let me just delve a little bit deeper into Singapore, the Singapore Agri-Food Innovation System, because this illustrates, in many respects, the role of the three big players: government, academia, and the private sector. What we don't have, what I haven't shown you is, of course, civil society. Because in some of the countries that are listening in, civil society is also a very important part of the innovation system. Now, if we look at it in different perspectives, the essential components of this innovation system are those shown on the left-hand column. Okay? The farms themselves, of course, in Singapore, in this case, vegetable, fish, eggs, normal food, the distribution systems, the supply chains, the post-farm gate, pre-consumer enterprises, which convert farm produce into market-ready products. Remember, I mentioned the innovation, the value chain. This is where the value chain comes in. Then food technology, which is a big investment area for Singapore. And one outcome is, of course, converting waste into useful food products. But the other two is new kinds of packaging, new kinds of ingredients, and converting raw material into food products. Okay? Some of you might be surprised to know that, in fact, Singapore does export some food, but higher value added products. And then the industrial sector with waste valorization. We know that there's a lot of food waste, also other kinds of industrial waste. Can this be converted, in fact? And that's where both government and the private sector come in. I indicated for each one of these the major players, whether it's the private sector, government, private, and so on. Yeah. Now then there is supporting or the enabling components. I've mentioned research institutions, and this is all either private, public, or academia. We do have private institutions, research institutions in Singapore as well. Education and extension, mainly public. Regulation, which is mainly government itself, or public rather. Yeah. Industry representation, quality assurance, international linkages, which is also obvious in the ecosystem complicated diagram I showed. No country, innovates based on its own merits alone. The international linkages are so important. Yeah. Then of course financing. And let me just finish off, by sharing this last slide here in the interest of time. An article that was written by Jeffrey Sachs, who was the advisor to the one of the previous UN Secretary Generals on sustainability. At the turn of the millennium, he actually said that if you look at the innovation map of the world, okay, a small part of the globe, okay, maybe some 15% of the Earth's population, provides nearly all of the world's innovations, technology innovations, even in farming. Okay? Then the second part, perhaps half the world's population, is able to adopt these technologies in production and consumption. And the remaining part, about a third, is usually technologically disconnected. And the picture is still pretty much the same today. So the question that we have amongst all of us, I think, is ask the question, where does your country want to play? What kind of innovation system would you like to see either today or 10 years down the line in your country? And I think webinars like this will help to kind of focus your thinking a little bit more. And I'm very happy that I've been part of the sharing process. Yeah. So thank you, Ted. That's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Teng. This is a quite excellent summary of the presentation. Then the second from the last slide that talks about the stakeholders, government, academia, and the private sector. Those are three tripartite must collaborate to enable innovations. So that's quite a good highlight with the needs of gathering of these all stakeholders together. Okay, thank you very much. And here I'd like to move on to the Q&A. While I receive some questions from the viewers, but I firstly like to ask you about the Singapore, the last question that I gave. So the self-sufficiency increase from 10% to 30% by 2030 is quite a big aspiration and challenging. But I'm interested in learning what kind of products or the innovations that you are going to introduce for this significant step change.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question, Ted. I think one way to answer this question is to perhaps state that the 30 by 30 is to achieve 30% of the nutrition needs and not the total production needs. Okay. Now, what has been identified are three categories, three major sources of nutrition for Singapore: vegetables, protein, alternative protein, and eggs. Okay. So a lot of the work that's been done is now focusing on these three products: vegetables, alternative proteins, and eggs. And by vegetables, I really meant the usual Asian leafy greens in particular, but also some of the fruity vegetables and so on. Okay. Now, the way this has happened is that, to support the innovation, I mentioned the policy goal, which is 30 by 30. But the policy goal was very strongly supported by implementation measures. And the most important implementation measure was the Singapore Food Story, which is basically a research and development story. So $144 million, okay, invested by the government to accelerate innovation, to support the 30 by 30 goal. Okay? But there were also other measures, like the Agriculture Productivity Fund, there's measures to build new innovation parks, and also to attract private equity. In fact, it's amazing how many private equity firms are in Singapore. Okay, apart from the big ones like AgFund, Yield Lab, and so on, there are many other smaller ones. Now, in terms of what the innovation focus is, okay, very generally, it is really on urban agriculture and peri-urban agriculture. Okay? Now, under this umbrella of innovating urban agriculture are, for example, urban vegetable high-tech farming with climate control farming, which has dual purpose. One is to grow more vegetables in a small space, but the second is to buffer it from the climate, because climate is controlled within these indoor farms. Another focus is on indoor fish farming, because Singapore only produces at the moment less than 10% of its own fish, especially in outdoor farms. So there's a big push towards indoor fish farming, especially in what we call the recirculating aquaculture systems, RASs, that can hold very high stocking rates. Okay? And then accompanying that, of course, is the other focus area of fish diseases and fish feed. Vaccines for diseases, and then fish feed from other alternative protein sources like insects and so on. But to put it all together, I think, and something that is very related to farming in the countryside is what we call smart farming or precision farming technology. Okay, in fact, you could say that a lot of the innovation focus is to derive precision smart farm technology to optimize the use of light, nutrients, water, genetics, and so on. Yeah? And I've already mentioned novel protein, the plant-based protein and the cellular protein, which is an entirely different category of innovation altogether. Yeah. So that will be my short way to answer your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maybe I like to shift the focus to the other Asian Pacific countries. That other Asian Pacific countries, then the farmers are small and the harsh environment, etc., and the growing population there as well. So among the leading innovations that you introduced, which do you think may have the greatest impact, particularly to the Asian Pacific countries? Could you share your view, please?
I'll be very happy to. Very happy to. I think we all know that the Asia Pacific, contains the biggest number of smallholder farmers. So our challenge is actually a doubly challenging one, because every smallholder farmer manages his or own field, usually in her own way, quite unique. So when we look at Asia as a whole, Asia Pacific region as a whole, I feel that one of the quickest impacts we can make by combining several technologies like biotech, digital tech, is in the area of crop production. Because most of our small farmers, are in crop production. Okay? Where we can target using the increased use of technologies to help monitor crop performance, which then allows corrective action to take, whether it's to put in more fertilizer, to irrigate, or to apply pesticides. And I showed in one of my slides, for example, this portable device, developed by ERI, the Rice Crop Manager, which can be put on a mobile phone and taken to the field. Okay, and other people have developed things like disease diagnosis aids that uses your cell phone and a cell camera. Okay, so combining this with proper genetics, which is crop varieties. Now, these two technologies together, I think, will make a big impact if they can be implemented, okay, at scale in smallholder farms. The second one that I see a big impact in Asia Pacific is supply chain logistics. Okay? Because we do waste a lot right now and lose a lot because of very inefficient supply chains that go from the farmer through distributors to wholesale to retail. Some of it is because of lack of cold chain management, of which there are technologies available, but which cost money to do. So the question here rather is not a matter of technology, but rather of financing, okay, of supply chain logistics. Yeah. Now, the third I want to mention very quickly is really biotechnology. I really feel that we're now entering a new era beyond GMOs. It's an era beyond GMOs. Although GMOs or genetically modified organisms still have a role to play in some of the more traditional applications like cotton and so on, but we're now entering the new era of new breeding technologies like gene editing, which can very quickly, very simply shorten time, get us the crop varieties that perform the way we want them to perform, whether they tolerate drought, submergence tolerance, tolerate higher temperatures, and so on. Yeah. So to me, in the Asia Pacific region, these are three sets of technology/applications that I think can have major impact here in our region.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your view. Good. So here I would like to move to questions from viewers. Then first question linking to the talk around the Singapore. So the question from Bangladesh, Mr. Ahmad Salahuddin, is that what the role of Singapore, Singapore is committed to contributing to the developing and dissemination of the innovation in other countries. So is there any kind of framework or plan to share the innovations to other countries in the region?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Salahuddin. I will answer that question in two ways. Okay? I think one way is through the official government channels, to the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also the Singapore Cooperation Enterprise. Okay? They do conduct visits. They do support visits, from others to Singapore. They also support workshops that share different kinds of approaches and technologies. Like, for example, just in 2 weeks' time, I'm doing one for Africa, okay, where we're sharing some of the ways Singapore tackles food security. Okay, not to say that everything we do can be adopted, but to show what potentially can be done. Okay, so that's one modality through the public government sector. Now, the second actually is through the private sector. I do communicate with quite a few of the private sector players, the big multinationals, but also the smaller startups and enterprises that want to expand overseas. One area, of course, is the indoor farming, indoor vegetable farming. Okay? Quite a few of these startup companies in Singapore, they are now established themselves and commercially are producing vegetables under indoor conditions, are looking to expand overseas. So this will be the private sector route. Okay? And again, I've left my email in my slide. I'll be very happy to put you in touch with some of these people if you're interested. You're happy to do so. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So here's another question from Pakistan, Mr. Arid. So the question is that what are the challenges for adopting organic farming rather than synthetic farming? So in the past, the innovations for productivity gain comes around the fertilizer and agricultural chemicals and genetically modified crops. That there are some sort of the debates about the safety or the environmental concerns. So maybe this question, and I receive also some similar question from other audience, that the organic, like growing area that concerns addressing the safety concern and environmental concerns, how this could be going along together with the innovations. So could you share your view, please?
Sure. I'm very happy to. My personal view is that organic farming as a farming method can and should coexist with other methods of farming. Okay? That's my first point, right? Now, to what extent that coexistence can occur really depends on the regulations in place and the farming community. The big challenge facing organic farming really is, as we all know, it's rather labor intensive in terms of preparing the inputs for farming. Okay? And also generally, in the short term, yields are not as high as so-called synthetic farming. Okay? And part of the reason, actually part of the challenge can be overcome because many of the varieties, modern varieties that are bred today, are really varieties that are responsive to synthetics. Okay? There's been very little effort to breed varieties that respond to organic farming where there's very slow release of nutrition, either from the compost or manure. Yeah. So there are challenges. Of course, the other one is pricing. I mean, we all know that in most countries, organic produce is a premium product. Okay. And price competition, the price premium is a major challenge indeed to make organic farming a mainstream kind of farming. Okay. Now, that's not to say it can't be done. I think it can be done, but it's going to take a lot of effort to do so. In fact, the final challenge I'll end this answer with is the transition from so-called synthetic farming to organic farming. Because during the transition period, many studies have shown this, is where the big challenge of maintaining yield levels is. Okay, because you need to fallow a piece of land for a few years before it can truly be classified as being able to be organic farm, basically. Yeah. So,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So up until now and in the past, then always the conversation is around organic versus synthetic. But now I think through a couple of leading innovations like drone technology and other precise applications, so then all the new innovations help agricultural farming to be more cautious on the safety and environmental protections. So I think the innovations could, to change the way have viewed about the safety for people and the safety for the environment or the sustainability things. I think that's what I have learned from you in the overview presentations. Thank you very much. Okay, I think okay. So there's one more question before closing. I'd like to pick up the final question. Okay. So Dr. Carsten Sergfog, he'd like to thank firstly for this great program. Thank you very much, Paul. And can I ask people of Singapore think of alternative proteins? It takes some time to adapt to these alternative food for Turkey.
Yeah. It's indeed a very relevant question, because there are different kinds of alternative proteins. The plant-based proteins, I think, and I assess, have been a lot more acceptable to most consumers. And that's because, as you know, in Asia, we have a history of eating plant-based diets, tofu, natto, tempeh, and so on. Yeah. So the transition from that to a plant-based protein is exemplified by the well-known Impossible Burger, Beyond Food. Is a smaller transition. Now, in the early days, pricing was an issue. Okay, but I don't think it's a big challenge anymore in terms of pricing for the plant-based protein. Now, our surveys have shown that there's always a population factor here, demographic factor here. There are some sectors of the population that will not eat what they call artificial food, which they view this plant-based protein to be. Others, especially the millennials, the younger people, are much more open and receptive to new kinds of novel food. So we see that distinction. Now, in the case of the cellular meat, there's really not enough data to know, but surveys have shown that people are willing to try them, okay? Because the arguments are there that you're saving the environment, it's cleaner and so on. But until they are commercialized fully, it's really tough to say whether people will accept them in total at all. Excuse me, at all. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I just wanted to close the session, but there's another question coming in. So if you don't mind, can I just touch on the very, very last question? Okay,
Certainly.
Thank you. Could you share the question from ROC, Kate Church and Chang? Accepting increasing the production efficiency, how do you gather more resource for securing the self-sufficiency food required? This is about the resource management, particularly on the global warming.
Yeah.
It's
actually it's a tough question to answer, okay, because overall we know that in Asia Pacific our freshwater resources are declining, our arable land is also declining, okay, which is why to try and make up for these two reduced resources, we go for basically like indoor farming, vertical farming, which uses a lot less water, okay, but does use more energy, unfortunately. But there's a lot of research going on right now to look at whether energy efficiency can be increased for some of this indoor farming. Okay? But you're absolutely right. In the longer term, unless we manage the resources for farming, our entire food production system is in trouble. Okay, and there's so little alternative sources of water or land for us in Asia Pacific. So it's an area that really requires a lot of innovation. Water harvesting, including one of them.
Thank you very much. So still some questions are coming, but we must close the session today. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Paul Teng, for the excellent presentation and the insights. So we learned quite a lot about the importance of innovations in the agri-food system, and Asia Pacific could adapt the innovations to tackle with the challenges. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Paul Teng. And
thank you very
finally, thank you very much. Thank you. And I'm closing this session today. And for those viewers who stayed with us, thank you very much. And if you have not done so already, then please subscribe to the APO YouTube channel so that you don't miss the future P-Talks like this. Thank you very much. Please stay safe, everyone, and hope that you enjoy us again for the future P-Talk. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Teng. Thank you.